500 years ago, the world's most influential architect was born. His name was Andrea Palladio, and his reputation rests on the buildings he built in Venice and Vicenza and in the surrounding countryside. Above all, Palladio is celebrated for his villas, the 30 or so country houses that he built for local aristocrats. The Palladian villa combines grandeur and dignity with intimacy and a human scale. For many, the Palladian villa is quite simply the perfect house.
His whole relation to architecture is very physical and very emotional. He liked architecture to make you feel good.
One of the things that I notice people comment on is how satisfying the rooms feel.
And they never want to leave the villa. In fact, they're always very sad to leave this wonderful and peaceful place.
I think that people consciously or subconsciously respond to what feels a comfortable space.
The house for Palladio becomes a sort of temple for life on this earth.
But Palladio's fame goes far beyond his buildings. By writing about his work, the architect became an ism.
He wrote a very good book, a very practical book, and a very useful book, which was then reprinted and retranslated and is still being printed today.
From the stately homes of England to the Washington skyline, from the plantation houses of the deep south to the newest executive estates, Palladianism is instantly recognisable. Pediments and porticos, columns and capitals make up the vocabulary of an architectural language that Palladio taught the whole world to speak, and which we still speak today. So how did a humble stonemason rise to become one of the master architects of the Renaissance? How did his influence spread all over the world? And what is the secret of the perfect house? In the late 18th century, the German Romantic poet Goethe jumped into a coach and headed south to Italy. He was in the midst of a full-blown midlife crisis, but like many Northern Europeans before and since, his troubled soul was soothed by the land where the lemon trees bloom, as he memorably put it. But nothing moved him more than the buildings of Andrea Palladio. There is something divine about Palladio's talent, he wrote, something comparable to the power of a great poet. Like all good tourists, Goethe had of course done his homework. He'd studied the 4 books of architecture, which catalogued Palladio's life's work and summarised his philosophy. But for Goethe, the actual buildings came as a revelation. You have to see them with your own eyes to realise how good they are, he wrote. Today, it's not only possible to see a Palladian villa with your own eyes, you can stay in one too. The Villa Saraceno, bought and restored by the Landmark Trust.
The villa was built between 1545 and 1555, and it's one of the earliest and most simple Palladio villas.
Lorella Graham has known the villa ever since it was opened to the public in 1994.
Palladio wanted to build his villas to give the enjoyment to the owners to stay in. It faces roughly south and goes through the sala to the north rear door and to frame the picture of the mountains. And there is a nice breeze coming from north, which is quite relief for summer.
His whole relation to architecture is very physical and very emotional. It's something intuitive and instinctive, which has to do with the way in which Palladio felt, experienced, imagined architecture as being something very much in contact with your whole being and with your body. And he liked architecture to make you feel good, not to make you feel anxious, not to make you feel that the world was an unsafe place, as he knew very well that it was, but to make you feel good, to be a consolation.
The visitor's logbook provides further testimony to the feel-good effects of Palladian architecture on those who experience it firsthand.
Lots of visitors who come and stay at the villa are people who are interested in architecture, of course, and in art. And some of them leave nice drawings and themselves, and they write their experience at Villa Saraceno. And they're all very enthusiastic and excited about coming here, and they never want to leave the villa. In fact, they're always very sad to leave this wonderful and peaceful place, which is the same feeling that Palladio wanted for his customers to get away from the worries of the city and find a peaceful and quiet and thoughtful situation, environment where people can relax and enjoy the countryside.
And this is the thing that's important about classical architecture. It can be very grand, but at the same time it can be very personal. So you can take this huge column, and next to it you have a door, which is made of the same proportions and the same sort of decorative treatment, but it's human scale. So, you can use it to make this rather interesting combination of grandeur and intimacy.
The house for Palladio becomes a sort of temple for life on this earth.
Palladio was born in Padua 500 years ago. His father was a miller, or a millstone maker, but whatever his precise trade, his nickname, Pietro dalla Gondola, Peter the Boat, suggests that he transported his goods on the network of canals and rivers that connects Padua to Venice and to the other towns and cities of the Venetian Republic. The region is now known as the Veneto, and its glory, then as now, lay not in the rather nondescript landscape, but in its cities, Padua, Verona, Vicenza, and of course Venice itself, where merchant princes ruled their republic from the Doge's palace with a ruthless hand. The politics of the Venetian Republic and the bitter rivalries of her subject cities would play a major part in the story of Peter the Boat's son, Andrea. Palladio was a child of war. It broke out the year that he was born, and it would reignite periodically until he was in his 20s. But when the war finally ended and the plague and famine that accompanied it died away, Palladio would be perfectly placed to take advantage of a post-war building boom. But first, he had to learn a trade. Palladio learned about architecture from the ground up as a stonemason, and the pragmatic, conservative instincts of the craftsman never left him. He was apprenticed in Padua, but ran away to Vicenza, where he joined the local stonemasons' guild. Vicenza was far smaller than Padua, but for Palladio it was a good move. Though he would never become rich, he would become famous here, a result that, from the little we know of him, he would have been happy with. According to well-founded legend, Palladio's big break came here, at the Villa Trissino on the edge of Vicenza.
Palladio
was lucky that his talents were recognized by Gian Giorgio Trissino, a Vicenza aristocrat. When Trissino built a house for himself, a country villa at Cricoli, he contacted a highly respected company from Vicenza. There was a very promising youngster working in this company, whose abilities Trissino recognized, and in a certain sense, he adopted him. He programmed him to ensure that he became the great figure that he did indeed go on to become. He baptized him with the name Palladio, who is an angel in a poem written by Trissino, who guides Italy towards its emancipation from feudalism. He took him to Rome to see the ancient buildings, the remnants of Roman architecture. And he taught him to become the specialist in a new language of architecture.
The essence of Palladian architecture is its relationship with ancient Rome. And of course it was a time when, unlike today, when, the future is something one is supposed to look to for guidance, then it was the past that you looked to, and particularly the antique past, the ancient world, ancient Rome.
He first went to Rome in the early 1540s, and he says he found far more to study in these ancient Roman ruins than he had anticipated, all of which he assiduously measured.
He completely rejects all the architecture in the decades and the centuries before his time, but he reconnects with the good architecture, the beautiful, true architecture of the Romans, which he's seen as being ruined, and it's necessary to recover it. And you've got to go to those ruins, study them, measure them, and pull out of them the true architecture.
The Pantheon was a building that was probably one of the most important buildings in Rome for Palladio, probably because of the rather simple, massive quality of the building. Simplicity is something that appealed to Palladio a great deal, but also because of the perfection of the proportions within the structure, because if you continue the dome down as a sphere, the bottom of the sphere touches the floor and the whole building becomes a single sort of perfect geometrical figure.
Palladio's appreciation of the Pantheon was inspired by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, whose 10 books of architecture formed a key part of his education in the library of Gian Giorgio Trissino. Vitruvius, a military engineer turned architect, was the source of what became the central dogma of neoclassical architecture, the hierarchy of the architectural orders.
That's a series of different kinds of column that held up a series of beams, effectively. And if you really want a definition, classical architecture is that which uses the classical orders in one way or another.
The basic orders are Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. There's also a fifth order, which is called Tuscan, which is a very primitive Doric.
There's enormous variety about them. And they start from very plain fat ones to quite thin decorated ones. That's roughly how it goes.
As you go from Tuscan Doric up to Composite, they get progressively more elaborate.
Not only do they get more elaborate, the proportions change quite considerably.
They get bigger.
The Doric is quite stocky, but then when you go up to Ionic and Corinthian, they get taller and more slender.
Each one of those relates to a human figure. So the Doric order, which is the shortest one, that is a man. And the Corinthian order, which is one of the taller ones with a decoration on it, that is a maiden, it's a young woman. That's rather nice, really.
Vitruvius talks about buildings having bodies, and he talks about the component parts of buildings as being their members. So this is almost like tailoring. It's like dressing the building in the most appropriate way.
But Vitruvius offered far more than fashion tips to the aspiring architect. His book contained within it the seeds of a rigorous system of architecture that Palladio would elaborate and make his own. Good architecture, Vitruvius said, had to be firmitas, utilitas, venustas, strong, useful and beautiful. And that meant above all symmetry and proportion. The scale and proportions of a building, Vitruvius said, should be derived from an idealized human figure, the Vitruvian man as it became known. The Vitruvian man's foot was exactly 1/6 the height of his body, the distance from elbow to fingertips exactly 1/4, and so on. Renaissance artists saw in the Vitruvian man a fundamental principle of design that they applied to everything, from portraits to cathedrals. Palladio was no exception. At the heart of his architecture is the Vitruvian man. But Palladio didn't just copy the Romans. By combining his first-hand observations of Roman ruins with his knowledge of Vitruvius, he would create his own architectural system, more scientific and rigorous than anything the Romans would have dreamt of, and applied not just to grand public buildings, but to private homes, like the Villa Rotonda just outside Vicenza.
He believed that Roman houses would have temple fronts on them, which is not actually true. And he put temple fronts, or porticos, on the fronts of his houses. And this is one of the major legacies from Palladio. Still today, that's what people do. Even modernists do it when they want to express an entrance. They put a series of very tall columns or pilotti or whatever they want to be called on the front. This is a huge legacy, but actually it's based on a historical misunderstanding of by Palladio of ancient Rome, the very thing he wanted to connect with.
In Palladio's day, the profession of architecture was still in its infancy. The great public buildings of the Renaissance had been designed by recognized artists, like Michelangelo or Raphael, or built by anonymous master builders. The idea of a dedicated professional who created an original design on his drawing board and then saw it through to the completed building was still relatively new. One of the distinguishing marks of this new breed was the ability to produce highly detailed technical drawings.
It is like a blueprint, so that there's no perspective at all. This is as if you had put a great sheet of transparent plastic in front of the real thing and just traced it point for point. This is a convention which has a very long history. It goes right back to ancient Egypt. It was used by the Romans, used by Gothic masons. But in the Renaissance, people became so excited by perspective, because perspective was like computer graphics, that often they abandoned it. Then there is a sort of repositioning for which Raphael, the great painter, was in part responsible. And he wrote a letter to the Pope saying, when you're making architectural drawings, you should use this method, the architect's true method, because you can take measurements from everything.
Per poter però controllare I sistemi complessi.
If you want to control complex systems and nature, you have to be able to measure them. And you also have to be able to pass on a system of measurements to the people who do the building work.
Chi costruisce un sistema straordinario di misura. Tant'è vero che Palladio, che scrive I suoi 4 libri dell'architettura nel 1570, inizia.
Palladio, who wrote his 4 books on architecture in 1570, begins his books, and his second one in particular, with a measurement known as the Vicenza foot.
Il piede vicentino. Questa è metà.
This is a half of the Vicenza foot.
Quindi lui dice, gentili signori.
So he says, gentlemen, this is the measurement, and you should take it into account. Because from this point onwards, I'll only be giving you the numbers. My drawings will contain numbers, and the numbers are based on this measurement. He says, watch out. If you want to build well and communicate through your architecture, you have to take the measurement into account.
Palladio's architecture seems classical and even conservative, but to his contemporaries it was something daring and new. The predominant architectural style of the region was Venetian Gothic, a fusion of Northern European and Byzantine influences. Palladio had something very different in mind. He showed the shape of things to come with the Palazzo Chiericati.
Palladio had his architectural degree with these buildings. He designed a building that was never seen before. The site was very particular because we are in the edge of the old city, in front of the harbor of the city, where the boat came from Venice. And so you are in the front of the water door of the city. Is really your entrance in Vicenza. And the idea of Palladio is to build this white statement, because you have to think that in the 16th century, Vicenza was full of colors, because all the facade of the buildings was with fantastic color, was decorated with fresco outside, and was also red of bricks. And this white building, white machine in the body of the color city is really a very clear statement of the new architecture connected with the tradition of the ancient Rome architecture.
Palladio's architectural visions were always grand, but they were also firmly rooted in practicalities. The imposing columns of the Palazzo Chiericati, for example, are not made of expensive marble, but from homely, humble brick, coated with marble plaster.
This is the Palladio secret, this idea to build brick columns with this kind of plaster. This is not original plaster, but looks like the original, mixing in the mortar powder of white marble, and so looks like marble, but is bricks.
By this and other methods, Palladio was able to create the illusion of grandeur without the expense, a skill that was much appreciated by the local aristocrats who, according to an old saying, had crabs in their pockets, ready to nip the fingers of anyone who dipped into them for no good reason. Less wealthy than the trading centre of Verona, less prestigious than the university city of Padua, less powerful than the republican capital Venice, Vicenza's regional standing rested on its reputation for high-quality silk and hard-headed business. And in hard-headed Vicenza, the decision to invest in architecture was taken for solid business reasons.
The local nobility wanted to maintain a high-profile image in the world and not to seem just a subject provincial city within the Venetian state. And this was important to them individually because if their city is prestigious, it increases their personal prestige and made it easier for them to get positions outside the Venetian state, outside Vicenza, and so on.
In return for working on prestigious private projects, Palladio was given the chance to tackle the city's most important public buildings. Just around the corner from the Palazzo Chiericati is the Basilica, the civic heart of Vicenza since the Middle Ages. Today it's being painstakingly restored, from the roof to the statues. 4.5 centuries ago, it was Andrea Palladio who restored the basilica. The original building had been in the Gothic style, of which Palladio disapproved. This was a chance for him to showcase the modern alternative in the very heart of his adopted city.
The basilica was a major public building of Vicenza. It was the law courts on the upper level, and then on the ground floor was a shopping mall, and it was surrounded on both levels with loggie, with covered arcades. Then in 1496 this structure collapsed, and so only in the 1530s did they think of rebuilding this outside, which was in a disgraceful condition.
Palladio came up with a bold scheme, proposing to the city council to wrap the basilica's medieval core in a new Roman dress.
You can say that he put ancient cloth in medieval bodies of the building in the same way in which his patrons represent themselves in the stage of the Olimpico as Romans.
The Teatro Olimpico is another of Palladio's public projects. It offers a utopian image of a city, dignified, virtuous, Roman, an ideal to which Vicenza's aristocrats aspired.
If you look at the stage of the Teatro Olimpico, the statues are not Roman heroes, but is the sponsor of the theater, the Vicentine nobility, dressed as antique Romans. So is this identification between the marvelous past of Rome and the present.
But Vicenza in Palladio's time was more like the Chicago of Al Capone than the Rome of Augustus Caesar. The city was split between two rival political factions, and bitter vendettas and personal feuds added to an atmosphere that often turned murderous.
We don't have to think to the Palladian Vicenza like a Athens of culture, arts, but was a very tough city because in Vicenza all the problems between the parties was solved with murders, with killing the enemy, with killing the rivals. And it's nice to think that Palladio is able to work with the two groups.
It does indeed say a lot about Palladio's personal charm and powers of diplomacy that throughout his career he worked all sides of the political and personal front lines that divided the city. He seems always to have been a consummate professional, charming his difficult clients and always being realistic about the compromises they imposed on him. The architect is frequently obliged to accommodate himself to the wishes of those who are paying, he wrote in the 4 books. Architecture, he added, is a profession everyone is convinced they know something about. But even while he worked hard to keep his customers satisfied, he quietly pursued his own agenda, which was aimed at loftier ends than aristocratic one-upmanship.
This is one of the reasons why Palladio is so important and so different from most architects, because it's not just his formulation of a system of architecture and his invention of particular architectural forms, but his definition of a way of life in relation to the building. He gives you a great sense of dignity, propriety, a sense of the building as a setting for a superior sort of life, not socially superior, but morally and intellectually superior. And he talks about the gentleman. And he really is not just receiving from the culture of the time a picture of a particular figure. He is creating it, moulding it, exploiting it for his own cultural ends, because he sees these rough, violent, often murderous nobles, and it's a way of trying to convert them into a different sort of person. He sees architecture as a way of reforming society, of making the world better.
Palladio made the world a better place in big ways and small, from Vicenza's imposing basilica to the elegant covered wooden bridge he designed for the town of Bassano. Strong, useful and beautiful. Vitruvius would surely have approved. But it was in the country villas that Palladio's idealism and ingenuity came together to create something new in the history of architecture. He built around 30 of them, and they came in all shapes and sizes. Some retained the character of the fortified farmhouses that they replaced. Others looked like stately pleasure domes designed to impress from afar. But though they were all particular to their location and to their owners' requirements, all of the villas were derived from a rigorous architectural system that make them unmistakably Palladian. Taking his cue from Vitruvius, Palladio developed a modular system that laid down the ground rules within which each villa played an elegant variation. All of Palladio's villas were symmetrical, and the suites of rooms that were arranged around the central hall were strictly proportional to each other. At Villa Foscari at Malcontenta, the idea of symmetry and proportion reflect the fact that it was built for two brothers, Nicholas and Aloysius.
It's no coincidence that this house was built for two brothers. Each of the two brothers had his own apartment, and each apartment is made up of 3 rooms, which demonstrates the extraordinary simplicity of Palladio. There are 2 rectangular rooms, the biggest and smallest, and these have exactly the same proportions, the harmonic proportions, about which Palladio theorized. The biggest room generally opened towards the north, so that it was cool during the summer, while the smaller room, on which the sun beat down, faced south, to ensure that it was warm in winter. These details help explain the practical sense of Palladio's architecture. And it's interesting to note that a man of such theoretical intensity could also pay close attention to the real nature of things. To really understand the impact that this architecture could have had on his contemporaries, we have to imagine the landscape at that time. This area was almost entirely flat. We're nearly at the edge of the lagoon, which contains nearly 500 square kilometers of water and no houses. In the 16th century, there were only a few houses with thatched roofs, so this house was truly massive by comparison with those thatched cottages. It was visible from a distance, enigmatic, a magic cube based on a rule that proclaims its own law, but which is difficult to understand. It was like a great voice that spoke in the desert.
Era come una voce che parlava nel deserto. La casa è costruita lungo un canale navigabile.
The house is built along a canal, and anyone travelling along it in a boat saw the building not only from the front, but also as if it was rotating. This innovation is the result of a theory, and this type of beauty is a theoretical beauty. It's what you might call the poetry of the rulebook. Palladio is a kind of demonstration that if you really want to be free, you have to stick to very complex ideas. And the better you are at obeying rules, the freer you are. Without rules, you lose yourself in a labyrinth.
Altrimenti ci si perde in un labirinto.
But for all his high-minded aspirations, Palladio never forgot that for his clients, their country houses were more than exercises in architectural theory. These were working buildings, with a very particular job to do. The wealth of the Venetian Republic had been founded on maritime trade, but the discovery of new overland routes and the fall of Constantinople to the Turks had undermined its role as the essential middleman between East and West. So instead of the sea, Venetian noblemen had started to look to their own backyards for ways to make money, to an area they called the terra firma. Money that would once have gone into ships and cargoes was instead ploughed into projects to turn marshland into farmland. The gentlemen of the terra firma, as Palladio called them, focused above all on a new money-spinning crop recently introduced to Europe from the New World. Indian corn, or maize, the key ingredient of the poor man's bread, polenta. Typically, a Palladian villa was divided into 3 floors: a bottom floor for the kitchens, a grand middle floor where the family lived when in residence, and a top floor which functioned as granaries and food stores. Did Palladian villas smell? The answer was yes. They smelt of the farmyard.
Dunque, noi siamo a Fanzolo.
We're in Fanzolo.
Questa villa sorge nel 1500, viene costruita nel 1500.
This villa was built in 1558 for Leonardo Emo, designed by Andrea Palladio.
Con la volontà degli Emo era quella di costruire una villa.
The Emo family wanted to build a villa in this area to give them a control over the corn crops.
La coltivazione del mais. E la sua architettura e il suo sviluppo,
and its architecture is based on the need to control the territory.
Proprio come villa per il controllo del territorio. La villa e le ville palladiane in particolar modo
The villa, like Palladian villas in general, has a central block, which is the owner's quarters.
E le 2 ali laterali, quella di destra e quella di sinistra, che sono le barchesse, sono questi 2 lunghi portici dove tra l'altro i contadini.
The 2 barchesi to the side are these 2 long porticos where the workers could take shelter and where they could go on working, protected from the sun and rain.
Che dalla pioggia. E alle 2 estremità delle 2 barchesse troviamo queste, diciamo.
At either end of the barchesi, we find these 2 little structures, which are dovecots, where the carrier pigeons live.
Sono le 2 colombare, le abitazioni dei piccioni, dei colombi.
They were kept here throughout the year, and when the owners were in residence, they were sent back and forth to Venice. You could get messages to Venice from the villa in 45 minutes.
La villa.
But true to his wider social programme, Palladio never forgot that all work and no play made Giacomo a dull boy. The villa wasn't just an economic hub, it was a spiritual one too.
Palladio explains in a very clear way what you do in the villa. He says that in the city the important gentleman will attend to public business and so on, but in the country he will manage his estate, try and increase his income by land improvement and things of the sort. He'll take exercise, which is good for the body and for health, and he will devote himself to study and cultural relaxation. It's a whole lifestyle.
The villas were designed to provide the perfect frame to support and enhance this lifestyle.
L'entrata, l'uscita, il percorrere queste stanze diventano come
the entrances and exits and the passages that pass through these rooms are like being in a landscape.
In questa straordinaria giornata d'estate.
And on an extraordinary summer day like today, we can see that these windows really are paintings, landscape paintings, which change as the day progresses, and in which the internal landscapes also change.
Cambiano anche I paesaggi interni, cioè si entra in stanze luminose, in stanze buie.
We enter well-lit rooms, dark rooms, high rooms, narrow rooms, and moving through them is like living in a space with your emotions as you pass through and move onwards.
Non lo vivi, e lo vivi passeggiandoci, cioè camminandoci dentro.
It's a great lesson. It teaches us simplicity, but also the notion of using architecture and the landscape as a way of making us aware of our emotions. It sends shivers up the spine sometimes to look at this building and feel the air pressing up against the window.
Today, the intimate link between Palladio's houses, the families that owned them, and the land they once dominated has been largely severed. Villa Amo, for instance, has recently been sold to a bank after nearly 450 years in the same family. And elsewhere, the fields that were once the villa's raison d'etre have been sold off. But at the Villa Barbaro in Mazères, house and land are still united.
The house and the land are tied together, and we believe that it's very important for the house to be able to sustain itself. So the only way you can sustain it is through what you grow. We have wine, we have granaries, the woods behind the house, we have olives that make olive oil. We work hard, and you want to have stamina to do it.
The Contessa grew up in the Villa Barbaro. For her, the figures in the celebrated frescoes by Veronese, added immediately after the house was built, became part of her extended family.
My playground was a house, and the people and the little animals that I could see in the frescoes. And I remember distinctively that I would go and play with my dolls in front of the little girl, probably to keep me company or something like that. This is the famous little girl, and she's said to be part of this staff. And I was always very fascinated, first of all because she was more or less my size, so I liked it very much, and I could see her right in the eyes. And the whole thing was beautiful to me. And I think I would have liked very much to have that little necklace also. There is a self-portrait of Veronese, very handsome. I was very much in love. He's very beautiful. While the lady said to be his wife, who is right on the other side, has a really very ugly face. And she looks in a very bad temper. So there was an old maid in the house that she said she did understand why Veronese had painted her so far away from him. She said, with that face, it's normal that he should put her right on the other side of the house. Oh, and then there is one other thing. I don't know if you've seen it. Come, I'll show you. And that is the Villa di Mazères. There on an imaginary landscape, but there it is. And exactly as it was at that time. We sometimes talk about it with my husband, and we think that Palladio is more or less flying around in his places and looking at them and how they turned out, and how sorry he must be because some of the very beautiful ones were destroyed. But we think that he's rather happy here. He comes to relax here because at least there is a little green around, and it still gives the idea of what the house was meant, that is to say, a farm. Very beautiful farm, very cultivated if you want, but a farm.
But Palladio's legacy doesn't just consist of the buildings that he built. It also includes the buildings he inspired others to build, thanks to the 4 books of architecture.
He wrote a very good book, the Quattro Libri, or the 4 books. Show off, you can do it in Italian. A very practical book and a very useful book, which was then reprinted and retranslated and is still being printed today.
The first book is the book which deals with, after a very brief discussion of building materials, it goes on to discuss the architectural orders and all the rules. Very brief explanations, and he's certainly not wearing his readers out with long texts.
It's the way that he does it that's so important. It's very accessible. Accessible words, accessible images. And as Charles is doing now, you can open the book at pages and get a wonderful sense in one brief glance what's going on. It was aimed at architects as well as patrons. It was meant to educate both, to raise the standard and expectations.
For all its down-to-earth practicalities and workmanlike tone, the 4 books is a highly idealised vision of what architecture could be. Freed from the inevitable compromises imposed by location, budget and client, these are dream books of architectural possibilities, and since their publication, many have dreamed the dream. For Thomas Jefferson, the American statesman and designer of Monticello, Palladio's books were quite simply the Bible. You should get it and stick to it, he advised. Lord Burlington, the first in a long line of English gentleman architects and the designer of Chiswick House, went beyond the 4 books to the source, acquiring the bulk of Palladio's surviving drawings in the 18th century. Every British architect of any significance up to the era of modernism is said to have consulted them. But even modernists acknowledge the influence of Palladio. Le Corbusier visited Villa Foscari in the 1920s and 30s and is said to have been inspired by its monumental character and its fusion of art and architecture to attempt his own groundbreaking modernist villas. Vernacular architecture too bears the mark of Palladio. In fact, many of our most fundamental ideas about what makes houses grand or desirable are derived directly from Palladio and his take on the architecture of ancient Rome.
Palladio has, if you like, a decorative legacy and a proportional legacy. The two things work together. It would be unfair to Palladio to separate them, but people do. And the 2 kinds of people do. There are architects who want to somehow relate to this great, hero and therefore legitimize what they do, who reduce it just to proportions and abstract it so that absolutely nobody except for them would recognize it. And there are also those who, on the other end of the scale, who believe that actually, because it's called Palladian architecture, if you don't do things that Palladio did, it's not classical. And this actually rather suits the people who don't believe you should be doing any classical architecture at all. They quite like this, because they can also say, oh, well, this is just copying stuff out of books, isn't it? This is photocopying Palladio's Quattro Libri and sticking it on the front of your building. I mean, I've had that said to me. So It suits. Well, it comes from one side out of ignorance, masquerading as knowledge, and it comes out of the other side as a put down.
Palladio remains serenely above the fight over his legacy, just as he did in the strife-torn city of Vicenza. Speaking always in the sane, practical voice that can be heard in the 4 books of architecture, he puts himself at the service of whoever needs him.
You get a voice, and that is a voice which is modest, which is concerned with doing his job properly, which is always stressing the need to serve other men and to be socially useful. But there's also ambition and there's also justified pride.
By the end of his life, Palladio had made it from the position of obscure stonemason in a provincial town to architect of choice in the big city itself. Though it prided itself as the home of Gothic architecture and much else that was quintessentially Venetian, Venice could no longer ignore Palladio's radical new ideas. And so it is that every year in July, Venetians celebrate the feast of Il Redentore, the Redeemer, to mark the passing of a terrible plague that claimed the lives of 500,000 citizens. And the focal point of their celebrations is the church of Il Redentore, commissioned in thanksgiving and designed by Andrea Palladio. The outsider has become woven into the fabric of the city. Palladio died in 1580, a couple of years after work on Il Redentore began. He's buried in an unmarked grave, believing that his work would prove to be the best and most enduring monument.